It's 1:15, so we can actually start today's lecture. Very good, the online people can hear me. All right. It's not yet the final lecture. Next week we have one more lecture to go. So this is, however, going to be the final lecture with new content. Because next week I don't intend to tell anything new. Yes, so next week is my intention to actually have a lecture in which I summarize what we've been doing and probably also go through some of the questions which were in the homework assignments or exercises, especially those which we think you might have found somewhat more difficult. Yeah. We will also use the Edu app for that. So I will basically ask in this group whether you understand the question, and then depending upon your answers, react to that. So next week is in that sense a rehearsal lecture, not really a lecture with additional content. So today is going to be the last one in that particular sense. The reason is obviously because we're going to have an exam pretty soon, and this is the information which I currently have on that. So on January 17th, you will have the exam. I hope that's in line with what you have in your calendars. Yes, the exam is a 90-minute exam going to take place here at the ETH. The rooms, however, we don't fully know yet because there have been 575 students who have registered, so that implies that there are quite a number of rooms necessary. Yes, not all of you are here, that's obvious. So we're trying to coordinate that, and on the Moodle we will most likely let you know who is going to be in what particular room, yes? Because at the moment it's simply not clear yet. Yes, please. Just with a non-electronic dictionary, it's meant an actual dictionary in the traditional sense of the word. So a book, you mean, so not electronic. Yes, really, yeah. For some of you it might be needed for language issues, but the exam is in English, obviously, as the course has been in English, but maybe for some of you a dictionary is helpful, and officially that is allowed, but this is supposed to be a non-electronic dictionary, so one which is physically on your table, all right? Yes. Please be on time for the exam, because as said, the group sizes are going to be large, and hence it's important that you all are seated well beforehand, and there are no problems associated to that. The content of the exam is actually everything which we discussed during the class, or which is in the chapters of the book, or which are in the problem sets which have been handed out to you. Yes, so that's what is being covered by the exam. And there will be 3 types of exam questions. Single choice questions, so true, false, so to speak, or yes, no, something like that. Multiple choice questions, so you have an A, B, C, D. And open questions, which are really open questions, where you can write your answer and tell us what you think the appropriate answer is going to be. Yes. So these are the 3 types of exam questions which we will be using. We will also put what we label mock exam on the Moodle page, either this week or next week, so that you can actually see how the exam looks like, and you also see what types of question we will be asking, so you can practice on the mock exam, so to speak. Yes. Besides the mock exam, we will also put a different PDF where there will be the answers of the mock exam, so you can compare your answers with the answers which we think are the correct ones. Okay, so that about the mock exam, which is not on this slide, but nevertheless probably important for many of you. Allowed material, as said, a normal dictionary and a normal calculator, yes, so a non-programmable calculator, because, well, you don't need to really have a calculator, because if there is going to be something which you have to multiply or add up, these will be relatively straightforward numbers. But nevertheless, I know you feel more comfortable with having a calculator next to you, so that's not a problem. Yes. Obviously, what you need is an ID, your student ID card, and something to write with, which is not a pencil. So it's a pen, a dark pen, a ball pen, that's perfectly fine. Okay. If there is anything which changes upon what's on here, including also where the actual rooms are going to be, then that information will all be placed on Moodle. Yeah, so please check the Moodle website also the evening before, just to be on the safe side that there is not something going wrong with the communication. Yes? All right. Any questions about this? I think these questions are normally posted such that there is only one answer correct, but there might be a D answer, all of the above or none of the above, or these kind of things. Yes? Yeah, so in that sense, if there is one answer, but an answer might contain several of the above. Yeah? Yes. I think that's already for technical reasons much easier to correct. Yeah? So if the computer knows there's one answer, then this is fine. Yeah? All right. Any other questions? Yes. The pencil, well, you can bring a pencil, that's perfectly fine, but your actual answer needs to be in something which you cannot easily wipe out. Yeah, so the final answer which you have to write down is with a normal ball pen or a dark pen, something like that. But if you would like to use your pencil for yourself to make notes or something, that's no problem. Yeah. Is the dictionary? I think the reason for this dictionary is for translation purposes, so one language to another language. So it's not supposed to be a dictionary which is completely English in which terms are being explained. So the answer is no. The answer is, what we mean with a dictionary is a translation dictionary between two languages which might be needed for some of you. Okay? Any other questions? No? The next slide is going to repeat exactly this slide. The only difference is the header of the slide. Yes? That's namely, in case you do not pass the actual exam, which was on January 17th, you have a repetition possibility on February the 27th, so during the first part of when the semester starts again. I think it's the first or the second week of the semester, not quite sure. Yes. Formally, this is only for those who did not pass the exam, so failed the exam. Yes. There are a few exceptions, but these have to be written exceptions, so which we don't actually decide upon, but the rectorate, etc., they decide upon the exceptional cases. All right? So in general, this is not for you to choose between these two dates. It's the first date which you're supposed to be at, and if you don't pass, then you can go to the second date. Yes? Okay? All the other information is exactly the same as before because it's going to be the same type of exam. Of course, with different questions, but the same type of exam. Yes? Okay. Any questions about this? No? Then we can look at where we stand. And actually, we're faster than expected at the beginning of this term. So we already discussed quite a bit of the Phillips curve. We're at the last part of that, and I'm going to continue with the remaining part of the Phillips curve, and then I'm going to basically talk about the previous crisis situation, the financial crisis, the euro area crisis, and the pandemic and the current energy crisis. So that's today's topic. And then next week, we're going to do the exam preparation part, in which I will summarize the entire course. So I was already summarizing every week the lectures, yes, so the more detailed information you will find in the book itself, but this is the summary of the summary, so to speak, which I'm going to give. So the overall overview. And as said, next week we're also going to go through some of the tutorial questions or the problem set questions which are on the Moodle website. And of course, you also then have the possibility to answer or to ask me anything which you think is appropriate. Yes, so feel free to use this last lecture next week and ask anything which is on your mind related to this particular course. Okay, good. Any questions about this? No, then we can move on. And this slide I didn't put on the website or on the Moodle. I just copied it back in because I think it is easier to repeat this very quickly. What we did at the end of last week is we looked at the Phillips curve situation in which we distinguish between a long-run Phillips curve, which is this vertical line, and as I said, the long-run Phillips curve is basically the long-run Eckert supply curve, but in a different dimension. Namely, we have now the unemployment rate instead of GDP on the horizontal axis, and we have the inflation rate instead of the price level on the vertical axis. But the principle behind it is basically the same. Yes? And we have a downward sloping short-run Phillips curve, which is basically the reciprocal of the upward sloping short-run aggregate demand curve, yes? Which basically reflects the same information, but again, in a different dimension. Okay? What at the end I was basically focusing upon was basically the experience which we made in the 70s or in the 80s, when in the 70s there were 2 oil price shocks. The inflation rate was way higher than people imagined would be feasible, and we tried, or policymakers tried to get away from that, and that's being reflected by this particular diagram. Actually, you can copy this story in today's world. We also this year and the previous year were surprised about much higher inflation than expected. For different types of reasons. It wasn't as simple as in the 70s, in which basically the cause was the oil price shocks caused by the formation of a cartel in the 70s, the OPEC. This time it's a bit more complicated. I might be talking about that later on. But we still have something very similar, namely inflation rates way beyond what central banks consider to be appropriate. Yes? And we also have the same problem as back then, namely back then, the inflation expectations were no longer anchored in the sense that people expected inflation rate to remain high. And also that is something which we currently observe. If we ask people about what the inflation rate in the next couple of years is going to be, most people will say a number which is well beyond the 2% target which most central banks have. So apparently our inflation expectations are again not there where the central bank likes them to be. And note that inflation expectations matter also for this diagram because they basically reflect the intersection point. If there are no other supply shocks and something going on, they intersect this intersection point between the light blue vertical line and the downward sloping dark blue line. Yes? That basically represents inflation expectations if there is not something else going on. And that apparently in this particular graph is too high, which reflects the end of the 70s or early 80s. Yes. And the central banks back then, Volcker in particular, was the Federal Reserve central bank governor back at that time. He basically promised policymakers, society at large, he is going to do whatever he can to fight this, and he is really going to basically go through or have the economy go through a recession to make sure that indeed the position of the short-run Eckert supply curve is going to change and actually over time move to a position like this red line over here. Yes? That was the intention, reducing inflation expectations and thereby reducing the intersect of the downward sloping short-run Phillips curve and the long-run Phillips curve. Yes, that's the purpose. And the price he had to pay for that is going through a phase in which the unemployment rate is much higher than one likes it to be. Yes, or in today's terminology, it's basically the same. The Federal Reserve already for a year now has been communicating that they will accept a recession just to fight inflation. Right? That's the same story. It's the same storyline all over again today. Okay. Well, okay, that's important to realize. This is basically the disinflationary monetary policy of the 70s and what we're going through to quite some extent today again. From this, you can calculate the so-called sacrifice ratio. The sacrifice ratio is the percentage points of annual output that is lost during this process of getting the inflation expectations down again by 1 percentage point. Yes? And back in those days, the estimate of the sacrifice ratio is 5. So at the end of the 70s, to reduce the inflation rate from something like 10% to something like 4%, it actually would imply a loss of annual output cumulative over that particular period in which this is needed of 30%, which is really substantial. Yes? And that's basically because we need time, or society needs time, to learn that they mean it seriously and that indeed the future inflation rate is going to stay low. Yes? That's the price we have to pay for that. Okay. In this particular sense, and that's what this slide is about, it matters how you model how people change their expectations. Yes? What I've implicitly assumed is that it takes time for people to change their expectations, that people are basically backward-looking. The reason why currently many people expect the inflation rate to remain high because they observe today a high inflation rate. And they extrapolate that into the future, and they behave accordingly, because that's, of course, what the problem is. The problem is not their expectations itself, but the fact that they behave according to these expectations. Yes? These are so-called adaptive expectations. Only by experience, you slowly change your mind about what the future inflation rate is going to be. Yeah, so it's backward-looking in many ways. And of course, then it will take time. If you go back here 2 slides, the movement of the dark blue line to the red line is only going to be very slow. Every year or every period, there will be a slight adjustment because the experienced inflation rate is lower than the expected inflation rate, and the expectations of the inflation rate will therefore go a little bit down. And this is then repeated over and over and over again until we're in the red zone, until we reach the red line. That's because of adaptive expectations, because of this assumed slow behavior in which society adjusts. Another extreme form is rational expectations. Yes? The rational expectations world is that, well, people are not that stupid. They're not only backward-looking, but they understand how the world works. They've taken a class like this one, so to speak, and basically know that ultimately we will be in this red zone again, and why not do that immediately? Why not change immediately my expected inflation rate to the target which the central bank communicates? Yes? Because ultimately we will end up there. So why not do that straight away? Because then it doesn't take years for us to be there. We can do this instantaneously, at least from an academic point of view. Yes? These 2 different modeling forms highlight as of how discussions in the 80s and 90s in macroeconomics went about. The Keynesian view was very much of adaptive expectations, and as you can imagine, the modern, more classical view is more about, well, people aren't that stupid, we can assume rational expectations, and then we're much quicker in the future steady state. So it's again the same story, which I keep on telling you. What's your view upon how the world works? Do you think that things only progress rather slowly, takes time for people to learn, adaptive expectations, or do you believe that we can almost instantaneously adjust our expectations, have very flexible systems, so to speak, and suddenly are in a new steady state, or quite quickly are in a new steady state? Yeah. This discussion also highlights why central banks nowadays worry so much about their communication skills. Central banking is more management of expectations than anything else, because they have learned from these models in the past. Yes? What central banks are doing is repeatedly saying what their inflation target is. Everyone knows what the inflation target of the ECB is. It's 2%. They've been saying that since 1999 for a reason. They hope that we all believe that, because in that particular sense, we would very quickly move back to the red line 2 slides ago. Yes? That's the overall idea of communicating what you intend to do and try to act accordingly. Yes? Ideally, they don't even have to act. If we immediately adjust their expectations, then there is no need for them to change policy, because we basically believe that they're going to do it anyhow. Yes? Okay. So that about this particular aspect, trying to make you a bit better understand why central banks are behaving the way they're doing. Okay, I already said Volcker, that's the guy on the left-hand side here, was the one who was chairman at the end of the 70s, and he was basically the one who got the inflation rate, in particular in the United States, but also in the rest of the world, back from rather high levels at the end of the 70s to much lower levels in the mid-80s. Yes? His successor was Alan Greenspan. He actually was a bit of a lucky guy from this inflationary perspective, because in the mid-80s, actually, there was not a negative oil price shock, but in the sense a positive one, because OPEC actually didn't completely manage to keep their things together, so to speak, and some of the OPEC members deviated from their overall policy, which caused a substantial fall in the oil price and therefore led to a disinflationary period, which helped Greenspan reach its own targets. Okay, but that's just a little bit of history of what happened in the 70s and 80s. Next step, which is being discussed in the chapter of the book, is, well, what we've done so far in our agri-demand, agri-supply framework is have a vertical, long-run agri-supply curve and a upward-sloping, short-run agri-supply curve, right? And what we see here is basically a modern version of a combination of the two in some sense, namely, the supply curve itself might not simply be linear, either extremely vertical, extremely horizontal, or upward sloping, but might simply be nonlinear in nature. Yes? And that's what we see reflected here. There might be situations in which the aggregate supply curve is relatively flat. These are situations in which the economy is under capacity, is producing way below capacity, and in that particular sense, there is not much chance that firms are able to change their price-setting behavior. Yes? So that's more or less an almost horizontal part of this curve. On the other hand, if firms are really at the extreme of their capacity, then the only thing they can do, if they notice that there is more demand, is instead of producing more, which is not feasible in the very short run, they actually simply charge higher prices. There is enough demand around anyhow, so hence what's happening is a price increase. To some extent, and I will show you later on today, this actually describes also part of what we're observing the last couple of months or the last year. Yes? In the following sense, you are all aware that there are supply chain problems. Yes, or have been supply chain problems that is now slowly abating away, but there was a clear phase in which especially industry goods were not delivered as quickly as normal, or what used to be normal before the pandemic. Yes? And what actually happened is something which can be reflected in this particular graph as an almost vertical supply curve. People were willing to pay a higher price to nevertheless get these goods. Yes? And of course firms noticed that. So we were, in a sense, in a situation where, at least temporarily, the supply curve was relatively steep. Yes? The reason was people also had the money to buy these goods. They actually went through a pandemic in which, on average, at least in the Western world, people saved much more than they usually do. And once this period went over, they actually wanted to spend more than before, but supply chain problems didn't allow them to get these goods as quickly as normally would have been the case. This is one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons why actually the inflation rate has been, or still is, relatively high. Yes? It's not only because of the energy shock, it's also because of the move out of the pandemic and the supply constraints which were there in the world economy. Okay, so this is basically reflecting that a little bit. Here I show you this non-linear upward sloping aggregate supply curve together with a couple of aggregate demand curves. Yes, actually quite a view. Yes, and what this makes clear is that in a downturn situation, any movement of the aggregate demand, so from AD1 to AD2, for instance, is going to be very, very effective in stimulating output, whereas at the same time, it will hardly have inflationary problems. Yes? If you, however, are in a situation like AD, what is the number, 4, yes, the aggregate demand curve 4, and if you then do the same kind of stimulative aggregate demand kind of policy, moving it to 85, then the effect upon output is much more limited, but the effect upon prices is very, very strong. Yeah, so depending upon where you are, monetary policy or fiscal policy can have quite a different effect upon what's happening in the economy. And what I was just trying to explain to you, that part of the story of the last 1.5 years was also that the supply curve appeared to be relatively steep because of supply chain problems. Yes. And nevertheless, we still were in a situation in which monetary policy and fiscal policy were very accommodative, as we might say, so very stimulative. That has changed with respect to monetary policy. We see interest rates going up, but actually that took a while before central banks started doing that. On the fiscal front, we don't really see restrictive fiscal policy. More on the contrary, we still think we're in crisis mode. We moved from the pandemic to an energy crisis, and if you see what's happening in many European countries, not to that extent in Switzerland, but in many neighboring countries, is that fiscal authorities are talking about how to support people with respect to the energy crisis and how they get through the energy crisis by stimulative actions, in a sense. Yes. So this is not necessarily reflecting or helping the inflationary pressure coming down. Okay. Good. That's a little bit about this particular view upon how an aggregate supply curve could also look like. What is clear from all the stories which I've been telling you is that we do realize that the aggregate supply curve normally moves outward, most of the time due to technological progress. Yes, but what the last part of this chapter is talking about is how we can actually try to stimulate this even further. How can we make the aggregate supply curve, either the vertical long-run one together with the short one, or this new Keynesian version, which is non-linear in nature, how can that one be moved to the right? Yes, and for that, it is, of course, obvious that we shouldn't be talking about the demand side. The demand side might help to get us out of recessionary states or reduce the boom from a short-term perspective, but here we need to focus upon the supply side. Yes, and what we normally do as economists is we distinguish between two types of supply-side policies, namely on the one hand, market-oriented supply-side policies, and on the other hand, interventionist supply-side policies. Yes, and the names already make it relatively clear what the distinction between the two is going to be. The first one is basically a very classical perspective in the sense we try to make sure that markets function as good as possible because the idea of the classical economist is, well, governments can never be as clever as the overall invisible hand is. Yes, the invisible hand will make the right decisions for us, the market economy will make the right decisions for us, and in that particular sense, we need to make sure that markets function. Yes, that's the market-oriented types of policies. The interventionist supply-side policies is more of a Keynesian perspective. What we need to do is actually a bit of the opposite, namely the government can do something very actively, can provide the right infrastructure, can actually try to stimulate certain sectors with subsidies, these kind of things. Yes? So that's another side of the coin. We're quickly going to look at these two sides now. Yes? So if the book distinguishes with respect to the market-oriented supply-side policies between 4 different forms, yes, talking about tax and welfare policy, talking about labor markets, flexible labor markets, talking about government size in general, reducing the government with respect to how much it spends, and deregulation and privatization. Yes? These are all steps towards trying to get the market to function better. That's at least the idea. So let's go through them. First of all, reform tax and welfare policies. Well, in principle, taxes actually are a price which you have to pay, which makes you not want to work as much as otherwise would have been the case. If you start working, you know that part of the income which you earn is going to be taxed, then this is reducing the incentives for you to work more hours. Yes? So in that sense, a higher tax rate reduces the opportunity cost of leisure. higher taxes encourage tax avoidance and evasion. So in that sense, taxes are, from this classical perspective, a bad thing. It is removing incentives of something which we don't want to be removed. Hence, in principle, it might be a good thing, to the extent feasible, to cut taxes. Yes? And actually, there was quite a discussion, and I'm now talking about, in particular, the area of Ronald Reagan in the 80s in the United States, in which the argument was, in those days, back then, taxes are so high that reducing taxes is actually going to increase tax revenues. Because by reducing taxes, people will start working more, and because they start working more, the income gain will be large enough to actually more than compensate the direct loss of tax revenues due to cutting the tax rate. Yes, that's sometimes being called Reaganomics. That's the philosophy which he followed through. So what Ronald Reagan actually back then did is cut taxes quite substantially in the United States. Okay, here we actually see the development, just a second, the development over a longer period of time. We actually, at the end of the 70s, early 80s, had in many, many countries very high top income tax rates. Yes, that has declined quite a bit up until the mid-90s, and since the 2000s, we've actually seen an increase again. Yes, we are currently again talking about having especially top income taxes being increased instead of being reduced. So we see waves in these kind of mechanisms here as well. So you had a question first, and then did Reagan's policy work? Well, yes and no. The Reagan policy was a bit of a problematic because it was at the same time in a world in which the central bank was trying to fight inflation. So on the one hand, fiscal policy was reducing taxes and stimulating the economy, and the central bank were trying to get us into a recession to make sure that inflation expectations come down and actual inflation comes down. So these two were not working hand in hand, let's put it mildly. Okay? So that's what we saw. What we can also see back in those years is that during the phase in which Ronald Reagan was president, the government deficit increased substantially. So in the sense that the tax reductions were apparently not completely compensated by income gains which led to tax revenue gains. Yes? So overall, that was not necessarily a period in which deficits were being reduced. So from that perspective, probably not. Yes? Okay. Same question. All right, good. All right, so we do see that also with these kind of tax discussions, there are movements. Things change over time. Now seems to be more a time, and you see that here with data up until 2012. That probably has continued since, that indeed the top income tax rate is rather slightly increasing again, not reaching the levels in the 70s or 80s. Yes, we're still not there, by far not, but at least deviating from what we saw at the turn of the century or in the mid-90s, in which these tax rates were much lower. Note also here there is a correlation between what countries are doing. That's called tax competition. If one economy is taxing high income more than the others, then that might lead to shifts in how people declare their income, and might even be leading to moving of these kinds of somewhat more mobile people in society. And so we do see that there are all kinds of dynamics happening here. To reflect this Reagan economics, of course, theoretically, the concept is right. Theoretically, it must be the case, and that's what's shown in the right-hand side graph, if the tax rate is 0%, then tax revenues are going to be zero, per definition, right? Because there is no tax. Yeah? The other extreme creates the same result, namely, if tax rates are 100%, then no one is going to earn any income. And no one wants to earn any income. So in the very extreme case of 100% income tax, who is going to work? Because everything you earn directly goes to the tax office. So there's no reason for you to work anymore. Hence, also in that scenario, tax revenues are going to be zero. So in the two extremes, we know that it must be zero. Hence, there must somewhere be an optimum. The big question is, where's the optimum? That's with respect to tax revenues. And the idea of Ronald Reagan was we were on the right-hand side of this curve. By cutting taxes, we actually go to a situation in which tax revenues are being optimized. Yes? It's always very, very difficult to really fine-tune this. We still don't know exactly where this optimum lies. Yes? But in principle, from an academic point of view, there must be an optimum somewhere. Yes? Conceptually speaking. But whether we are currently on the left-hand side or on the right-hand side, difficult to say. It probably depends upon the political color which you might have when you look at these kinds of data. Yes? Okay. Good. Next type of policy, market-oriented supply-side policies is looking at the labor market. As we want labor markets to be flexible from this classical perspective, reduced union power, encourage local level wage agreements instead of macroeconomic national wage agreements, because all of this is in tendency allowing for prices to quicker adjust to an equilibrium. Yes? We want to have a situation that wages, that's the form of prices we're talking about here, can adjust very, very quickly to changes in the situation, and that should lead to a reduction in long-term unemployment. So basically removing the implicit or explicit boundary which might exist in these kind of systems. Well, allowing more short-term contracts, these kind of topics are being discussed when you talk about this type of policy. Also in this context is information, making sure that there is no matching problem. So it's a little bit repeating what we talked about when we talked about long-run unemployment. Yes, all of that are supply-side policies which might help in reducing frictions on the labor market and thereby stimulate the accurate supply curve moving to the right. Third group of ideas is simply talking about the government size. Yes, we know that if the government spends more, runs a deficit for instance, then this does imply that it is crowding out private investment activities. Yes, that's what we've seen in the Keynesian types of models. If our savings either go to the private investors or go to the government, who basically needs to borrow money to do some additional spending. So in that particular sense, trying to circumvent that might make sense. Okay? The other point is that you can always question how efficient the government is in spending its money. There are not necessarily the same kind of market pressures on governmental decisions, so there might be inefficiencies involved. That's the overall idea. So in that particular sense, if the government can resize itself or downsize itself, basically having more functions being taken care of by the private markets are thereby assumed to be more efficient, this might be a win-win situation. Yes. Of course, this is a very classical point of view and assumes that markets do function. And as soon as there are market imperfections, then you have good arguments against this. Okay. Well, this almost automatically moves into this view. This is the Thatcher view in the United Kingdom, so to speak, that we should privatize as much as possible, deregulate the economy as much as possible, because markets are the most efficient outcome, or produce the most efficient outcome. And we've seen clear waves of privatization, for instance, talking about how railway systems in certain countries work. The UK is the most well-known negative example of this, in which they privatized a lot, and it took them decades to basically get this a little bit functioning. But the idea was back then that by having private markets compete with each other, or private companies compete with each other, it should actually result in a very efficient railway system. Well, you can make your own judgment whether that actually has prevailed, yes or no. Switzerland took a more careful point of view. We do have different companies at local regions providing railway services, but in general it's still very much nationalized, and most people would say it's functioning pretty well, although it is, internationally speaking, very expensive. Yes, so, but apparently Switzerland is willing to pay a relative high price for a high quality service. Okay, so, but this is this type of discussion which has been going on for decades and which continues to be going on. Yes, privatization, deregulation, these kind of things. What is also clear, just a second, what is also clear with respect to deregulation, when after the break I talk about the financial crisis, there have been episodes in which deregulation clearly went too far. This is about the banking sector, as what we see before the financial crisis is that there was so much deregulation going on inside the banking sector that this created a bubble which actually bursted and which caused all kinds of negative consequences. So in some situations you do need at least a certain degree of regulation. Always the question is, what's the optimal amount? It can't be too much, but it shouldn't also be too little. And where the optimum is not that straightforward. Yes? Yes, competition law is a sense of trying to make the market work. And in that sense, you're right. These are rules which actually hopefully make the market function better. Yes, and but that's not necessarily what was being meant here. It was more being meant, okay, there have been all kinds of restrictions as of how banks work, what the equity restrictions were, what they can put in the balance sheet, what not, these kind of things. And over the years, in the early 2000s up until the financial crisis, these rules have been, well, loosened implicitly, sometimes even explicitly. And that actually is what's being meant here with deregulation. Here in a negative sense, but of course the classical economists would also come with positive examples in which deregulation actually works. As financial markets very often are relatively deregulated and do produce very often efficient outcomes. Not always, but most of the time they do. But you're right, you can also think about regulation helping markets function, and in that sense it's regulation instead of deregulation. Okay, good. One slide only on the intervention in supply-side policies. Well, there I already gave a couple of examples, namely infrastructure investment, some types of activities like building tunnels, building railroads, building highways, building canals, and these kind of things. It's very, very difficult for private companies to take care of that because these are in many ways so-called public goods, and we need the government to do that. And you might take a more interventionist, Keynesian type of view and say the government should make sure that this type of infrastructure is being provided and hence can actually invest in those and might even run deficits for that and might actually be somewhat larger than otherwise would have been the case. Yes? Because that is something which is needed for the economy, the private market, so to speak, to actually function. The same holds for education and training. Without government support, it is questionable that the same degree of human capital formation would take place, although if you simply look at the United States, there the educational system, at least from a university degree onwards, is very much privatized, and it doesn't look that that system doesn't work. So we have different systems around the globe, and all of them seem to work to some degree. All of them have their problems. It's not obvious which of them is the better one. But investment in education and training would be one of these ways in which you can think from a supply-side policy point of view, this might help getting the accurate supply curve further out. R&D is something very similar. Yes, who is funding the construction or the investment in R&D and research and development? To some extent, this is done by, in particular, larger multinational companies, especially if you think about the pharmaceutical industry. But of course, it's also done by the ETH, by universities, by all these kinds of instances. And there, the government does play an important role. Yes. Regional industrial policy. Well, sometimes it looks like governments know better than the market as to what the new technology is supposed to be and invest in that. This doesn't always work as nicely as one might think. If you simply look at, for instance, Germany trying to invest quite a bit into solar power energy, which actually at the end of the day didn't really succeed. The Chinese were much cheaper and much better in producing these kind of technologies than Germany ever would be. Yes. So also here, it depends upon your view. You have good cases, you have bad cases, but the idea here is by changing the structure of the economy, you might actually get the economy further going. Okay, let's have a break first, and after the break I'm going to talk about the crisis situations which we had over the last couple of decades. We can now move on to talking about crisis situations in this century, so to speak, yes? So we're going to talk about the financial crisis, the euro area crisis, and also a bit about the pandemic and where we currently are. It's at least my intention. For the crisis which lie a little bit further behind us, there are a couple of videos which I would recommend you to look at. It's entertaining on the one hand. On the other hand, you will also see things you've seen during this macroeconomic course. This is a YouTube video on the financial crisis. It's a, I think, 10 minutes or 11-minute video. I won't play it here. You can do it at home. Please have a simple look at that. And if you have any questions about this particular video, then more than happy to talk about that next week during our final lecture. What I'll do is I'll summarize the financial crisis not the way the book does, but actually more from my own perspective. Okay. Okay, from my own perspective, which doesn't necessarily bite with what the book writes, but gives you a somewhat, slightly perhaps, more moderate view in some ways. So if I would summarize the financial crisis on one slide, then this is actually the summary I produced a couple of years ago after the financial crisis was over, based upon how I experienced it. It consists of 3 blocks. The first block are the preconditions. What was creating an environment in which this was possible? The second block basically continues upon that and shows more the negative sides of the story, where the first block does not necessarily have any negative or positive connotation to that. You might even say all 3 bullet points there are positive, but the middle part is actually highlighting where the problems then started, and at the bottom you will see what the results are, and the next few slides are going to go a little bit deeper into that. So what was the situation before 2007, so to speak? We had a strong phase, in particular in the 90s, in the early 2000s, in which globalization was happening quite a lot, and not only with respect to exports and imports, but in particular also financial globalization, so capital flows. Foreign direct investments are net capital outflow, as we labeled that during this course. Yes, money was flowing across the borders very, very, very easily, and still does. Yes? So in a sense, many would say this is a positive point of view. Economists in general like globalization, including financial globalization. It should improve efficiency. It should make sure that financial means are being allocated there where it can actually do the best work, so to speak. Yes? So that's the first thing. Financial globalization made, in a sense, the world much more interconnected. Second thing is we had relatively, for those years at least, a loose monetary policy. What happened after the financial crisis was even much looser, but up until that moment in time, we didn't see such a long period of what was then considered to be low interest rates. Yes? And that also implied that there was quite some liquidity in the system. Third element is in the financial market, not only globalization was happening, but also new products were being produced, so-called securitization products, yes, in which, for instance, mortgages were pooled together. You had a large group of different mortgages of different houses pooled into one big pot, and then out of this big pot, new financial products were being produced with different levels of risk, yes. That was the first level of securitization which was happening. This actually improved efficiency quite a bit. And in that sense was in principle, a positive innovation. Okay, that's the first block. And as said, the first 3 points, some people would even consider those to be negative, but they're not necessarily negative. They might even be considered positive. Second point, we were in a world in which there were, and we still are in a world in which there are so-called current account imbalances. And in particular, this is leading to a so-called savings glut, as people would label that. There was money flowing, in particular from the emerging markets and countries like Switzerland, into other countries, in particular the United States, in the search for return. Interest rates were, from their perspective, relatively low, so as soon as there was a little bit of a better return on your financial investment somewhere else, in particular in the US, you tried to use that. Yes? So that's basically what's happening here. Financial flows were happening to quite some extent, and in particular in those years, and still today, there is quite some inflow into the US, reflecting the current account deficit of the US. Yes, the current account surplus is, in our terminology, net export being positive. And that reflects in the aggregate that there must be an outflow of capital. So Switzerland is, in general, investing into the rest of the world. If we would have all have balanced trade balances, or current account which were balanced, then there would not on net be so much of an outflow. Yes? Now there was on net a strong outflow from, in particular, China, but also Switzerland, into, in particular, the United States. Yes? And that happened partly due to financial globalization, partly due to these imbalances in the current account. Okay. Second point is referring to the securitization innovation. Actually, I try to very quickly say what happens with securitization. You basically have different mortgages, 1,000 houses in Germany, 1,000 houses in the United States, which have different mortgages, and all these mortgages are being pooled into one vehicle, and out of that particular vehicle, you basically construct new financial assets with different classes of risk. So you have AAA products out of that, but also BBB products out of that. Yes? That's the first layer of securitization. And in that sense, diversifying the individual risk in these individual mortgages in a much better way. Well, this is somehow understandable. But the problem was back then, well, somehow understandable. Yeah? The problem back then was, hey, if we can do this with actual mortgages, we can also do this with these BBB derivatives, which came out of the first layer of securitization. And we can also pool these BBB financial products together and create out of those even AAA's version together with a couple of BBBs again. Yes? So we can again do the same trick as we do with the individual mortgages with the products which resulted out of the first layer of securitization. Well, you can guess what happened. Also, that can be repeated. Well, if at the end of the day you hold one of these financial products, you know, theoretically at least, there must be a couple of mortgages at the very end which are associated to what you have in your hands. But this association was very intransparent and basically no longer feasible. Yes? So that's the problem which is being laid here, being put down here, lack of transparency, multiple securitization layers, people who are holding financial products, which they know ultimately are related to some kind of mortgages in the US. But there were so much things happening in between that it wasn't transparent anymore which mortgages you were actually relying on. Yes? The second layer of securitization is conceptually exactly identical to the first layer. Yes? In the sense that you have these 1,000 individual mortgages being pooled, and out of that you create a financial product with different levels of risk. If something happens with the pool, then those with the highest, with the lowest risk associated to that, so the AAA basically, will not be the ones who will be hit first. But those with the financial products which have lower or higher level of risk associated with, so triple Bs or something like that. Yes? With these 1,000 mortgages and these products, this is still somehow understandable how that would work. Yeah? So if there are, from these 1,000, a couple of them who are not able to pay back the mortgage, then those holding the triple B will probably not see all of their money back, so to speak. Yeah? But of course, they also get a higher return in general if they do pay back because they're risk takers. Those with the AAA get a much lower return in general because they basically do not bear risk unless of these 1,000 mortgages, almost all of them go bankrupt or are not able to pay back the mortgage. So that's how the system works, yeah? Or that particular system. The second layer of securitization is in principle the same thing again, but now you're not pooling mortgages, but you're pooling thousands of these triple B financial assets. And again, you can do the same trick. Out of these thousands triple B financial assets, you can create something which has low risk and which has high risk. If something happens with these triple Bs, then the one with the high risk will not see the money back, but with the low risk might still see the money back, but of course get in general a different return. It's the same principle, but just as a different layer. Yeah? But of course, these triple Bs, they have problems if something happened with the mortgages in the first place. So there are links with the mortgages ultimately. So that's conceptually what was happening. Of course, it's a bit more complicated, and I try to conceptualize that to you, but I'm a macroeconomist, so I do a lot of hand-waving. But this is the general idea of what happened, as far as I understand it, with securitization. Yes? Creating new financial products out of existing financial products and ultimately mortgages. Okay? These products were so complicated that the supervisors also didn't really understand what was going on. Yes, and to be quite frank, if you look at how the banking system works, those people inventing these kind of new products, they actually earn decent incomes. Those supervisors were, in a sense, civil servants and were not on the same salary scale as people in the banking sector. So you already see the difference in levels of human capital, so to speak. Yes, the bright guys and women, they went into the banking financial sector, earned huge amounts of money creating these kinds of new products. And the ones who didn't make it into the banking sector, they ended up in supervising the banking sector. And didn't necessarily completely understood what's going on there. Partly also because of competitive issues, yes, because that's the way how it works. Banks were going to the supervisors and saying, hey, I have a new product. You have to allow me to sell this product because if I don't do it, then people in another country will start doing that, and you don't want the competition, the competitors to go away with this, and it's going to be perfectly fine. So they actually convinced supervisors to allow these products, probably much easier than otherwise would have been the case. So that's the third bullet point here, lacks of supervision and regulation in the financial system. If these products get that complicated, it is very, very difficult to really supervise them. Then we have the rating agencies. Yes, rating agencies basically had also the wrong incentives because they're normally being paid by the bank who shows them a new product and asks them to say whether this is a AAA product or a triple B product or something in between. Yes? And of course, the bank likes to have a AAA stamp on it. And the bank is the one who is paying the rating agency. So the rating agency wants to sell their services. And of course, it is then more likely that they're willing to give it a AAA than what is perhaps needed. So in that sense, the incentive schemes worked in that particular way. Yeah. So that's the distorted incentive for rating agencies. Then on the other side, we have, in particular for the United States, but it doesn't only hold there, but in the US it was very obvious, we had a policy in which the government tried to support the parts of the American dream. Namely, part of the American dream is everyone owns his or her own house. Making that possible for every citizen in the US was something which was achieved, or they were trying to achieve. Yes, and hence they allowed people with very, very low income, basically to nevertheless buy houses with, in those years, very low interest rates, but very often variable interest rates, meaning that as long as the interest rate stayed low and they wouldn't lose their job, they could probably manage. But as soon as the interest rate went up, or they would lose their income because of a recession or something, they would run into problems. Yes. So that's basically the problem there, subsidizing home ownership, trying to stimulate people into own houses, so to speak, which, as long as the bubble doesn't burst, might work, but if there are problems, then this is going to be problematic. Yes. So what happened as a result out of this is a system in which the financial sector, but also households, were over-leveraging, were taking excessive levels of risk. Yes, without necessarily completely realizing that. Because most of the time, the ideas of these models underlying these procedures were, well, if one house owner is not able to pay back, the system will not collapse. Completely right. Yes? So the individual or the micro perspective on many of these problems were as such, yes, we can deal with a couple of these house owners not being able to pay back the mortgages. Yes? But they didn't take a macro perspective. What would happen if not only a couple, but actually quite a few of them, or a quite large number, would run into problems? What then? Yes. The other thing is that the financial sectors were the financial institutions became more and more complicated. Banks had their own special vehicles outside of the balance sheet in which certain types of activities took place, which makes everything very much interconnected, but also very intransparent. Yes. So that was an environment in which we basically lived back in those years. Well, in 2006, 2007, we actually observed inflation to pick up. We were in a boom scenario. So as we know from our models, a boom scenario implies GDP is higher than usual. In the inflation rate, the price level tends to go up. So as a consequence, of course, the Federal Reserve, the central bank, started to increase interest rates. Yes, and here you see 16 months in a row, they basically increased the interest rate upward. And this created a situation that the boom was over. They were moving towards a slowdown of the economy. And actually, many of these homeowners were not able to pay back their interest payments. Yes. If this is happening for just a few, this is not a problem. But if this is happening macroeconomic-wide, then this is going to be a problem. And actually, these house owners started to sell their houses, but in a market in which the economy is going down and interest rates are going up, it will become more and more difficult to sell your home. Yes? So this is basically then something which, intensifies itself. Yes? So as prices fell, more and more people found that they actually were owning houses which were worth less than what they initially thought, and sometimes even less than the value of the mortgage. And that was also an artifact of the US system. The construction there was as such that the bank ultimately could be made responsible for these houses. So many of these homeowners, they realized that they have a mortgage debt which was higher than the value of the home. So their solution was simply give the key of the home to the bank, and now the house is the bank's problem and not their problem anymore. Yes, that was feasible in that particular system. Yes. This created, of course, that the banking sector suddenly was in a situation in which they were owning houses of values which were not in line with what was on the balance sheet, and somehow had to deal with that. Yes. And then we had these complicated securitization problems. So somewhere along the line, there were people holding financial assets who actually should be bearing these costs. And it wasn't obvious who those were. Yes. And that created then a situation in which people started to mistrust each other. That's what we see here. We saw a bursting of the housing bubble, forcing banks to write down the value of their loans. That created a so-called credit crunch scenario in which banks, because they had to resize themselves, were no longer able to provide the normal loans to normal credit takers. Yes, and That's not necessarily the biggest problem, but the more serious problem is that everyone started to question whether certain financial institutions would actually make it up until the next day. Yes, and we know that how the banking system works, it's basically they have short-run deposits against long-run loans outstanding on the balance sheet. It's a maturity transaction which is happening in the banking sector. And if now the deposit holders start to worry about the solvency of a particular bank, then they're going to withdraw money from that bank. Yes? And if you all do that at the same time, then this bank is going to run into problems because it needs to refinance itself to make sure that the system works. Yes? This is actually what we would label a bank run. And the photo here on the lower right corner is showing a situation in the United Kingdom with Northern Rock, in which people were actually queuing to get their money from the bank accounts. Yes? That's the classical example of a bank run. And as we know from one of the first lectures I taught here, this doesn't work. The money, your money, is not necessarily right now at your bank. Only a certain fraction of that money is at the bank. The rest of the money is working for you. But we cannot all at the same time get our money back. Yes? That makes the system collapse. Yes? And this is then, in a sense, a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you notice that one bank has problems, then someone else at a different bank is wondering, might I not have the same problems? And because of the intransparency of the system, you don't really know who is involved to what extent. We all react in a very similar manner. Yes. So everyone's suspicious of everyone else. There is no short-term credit available, yes, because all the money is needed to give that to those people who want their money back. Yes, banks will not lend to each other because the other bank might be bankrupt next week or something like that, so I'm not going to give them any money. And as soon as there is any kind of rumor about something might happen, this is creating a bank run. Yes, and that's a downward spiral. Yes. This was then in particular obvious when one of the key players, Lehman Brothers, was no longer being rescued by the US Federal Reserve. They basically had back then the impression this particular company, Lehman Brothers, was not only invested in the US, but was very much invested in the rest of the world. And they thought that this one could probably go bankrupt without hurting the US to such a large extent. Hence, it wasn't rescued. But with hindsight, they probably would have rescued it because this triggered indeed a bank run type of scenario in these world financial markets. Yes. And their central banks had to step in. If these banks don't provide liquidity to each other anymore, it must be the central bank who's doing that, and that's what central banks did. They actually provided huge amounts of liquidity. And for instance, in Germany, the back then Chancellor Merkel actually announced, declared that everyone would have their bank deposit guaranteed, that no one had to fear that they would lose their money. This was just the attempt to circumvent, or actually the successful attempt of circumventing a bank run. Simply claiming that the money is there. Well, we know that that's not possible. Yes? All right, but this was just preventing a bank run. Okay, so these kind of actions were taken back then. Okay. So, the problem in this entire system is a problem of moral hazard. Yes, you actually, as a central bank or as a government, you want to have people who have taken risk and played the game, so to speak, that they also notice a downside. That if things do not turn out as what they hope to be, that they're the one who are paying for this. Yes? These banks, for instance. But what happened, of course, is that in this particular situation, there was nothing else left for central banks or governments to rescue the financial system, to step in. Yes? And this is, in principle, leading to what we label a moral hazard problem. Because if a bank knows that in the worst-case scenario they will be bailed out, then that implies that they can take more risk than otherwise would be the case. Yes? And of course, that's not what we want. So in the long term, we will always claim that we will not rescue these banks, so to speak, that they will have to pay their price. But if it really comes as back then in 2007, 2008 to a situation in which the entire financial system might collapse, then there is nothing else as you can do and to bail out these participants, these financial institutions. And we've seen the same here. This is not only a problem in the US or in some other European countries. We also had the same problem here in Switzerland with the UBS. The UBS was being bailed out because there was a systemic risk at stake. Yes? And this created, of course, a moral hazard problem because the Credit Suisse, TKB, and other banks might learn a lesson out of this, namely that if it really becomes very difficult, there is still a central bank and still a government who are going to rescue us. So that's not creating the right incentives. So that's in a nutshell what economists mean with the moral hazard problem. Yeah? We create the wrong medium to long run incentives. In the short run, however, we don't have a solution for the problem because we don't want the system to collapse. Yes? Okay, that's what we see more or less listed here, talking about Lehman Brothers in particular. I won't repeat what's on the slide. Well, the reaction was obvious. Credit markets, financial markets froze completely. Central banks, in particular ECB and the Federal Reserve, started to inject liquidity into the system. So banks didn't trust each other, but of course they still trusted the central bank and took the money from the central bank. Yes. Interest rates were being cut because of the recession in which all of this was being brought into. And also fiscal policy. We're talking about how to stimulate the economy and how to support the banking system, refinance the loss in equity in some of these bigger banks in financial institutions. Yes. Out of that, of course, there was this clear call towards having more regulation in the banking sector, and actually the years after that, we see regulation in the banking sector increase substantially. Yes, that was basically the reaction towards the moral hazard problem, regulating them even further to circumvent this from happening, hopefully, in the future. Well, lessons learned out of this. Was weak regulation to blame for the crisis? According to some, yes. Yes, not everyone agrees upon that. Can stronger regulation help? Well, let's hope and see. The problem with a crisis is all of these crises in the past have always been triggered from a different dimension. Yes, no crisis is identical to a previous one. So we now have rules, regulation in place to circumvent the financial crisis in its form as it happened back then to happen again. But it doesn't mean that there can't be another type of crisis for which the regulation which we currently have doesn't fully work. Yeah. Well, the summary of the OECD a couple of years ago about the lessons learned out of the financial crisis are being listed here. 4 points. We had a problem with the bonus culture in banks, because that's indeed one of the reasons why these banks were so risk-taking, because the individual investors inside the banks, they were seeing quite some increases in their bonus payments because of the actions which they played, and at the end of the day were bailed out by the bank and by the government if things didn't work out. As already said, credit rating agencies were a problem, still to some extent are, but there has been increases in regulation there. Basically, they have the wrong incentives, and that needs to be changed. We have failures in corporate governance. That's the regulation by the regulator, so to speak. We have ever since seen that in every country, these regulator agencies have been improved or has been assigned more and more resources and more human capital. And also these banks themselves have learned that they shouldn't only look at the microeconomic consequences when one of these mortgages collapses, but actually look at the macroeconomic consequences and see what systemically might be going on. Yes, so that's the risk management part here. Yes, it doesn't suffice if you only act as if you are the only one who runs into problems, whereas the rest of the market is still very healthy. Most of the time, if you're in problems, then most of the time the rest of the market is also in a problem situation, and that actually makes everything much worse. Good. That a little bit about the financial crisis. Next step, quickly, is the European debt crisis, which was a follow-up of that. in a sense, because during the financial crisis, we saw that governments supported the economy substantially. Deficits were really skyrocketing, at least from those years' perspective. And that actually created problems inside the euro area, because inside the euro area, we basically have one currency or implicitly fixed exchange rate regimes, so depreciations were not possible. And if then things happened the way they did, this might create problems. Also here is a nice video. As you can see, it's 12.5 minutes long. That actually starts with the financial crisis as a lead up into the European debt crisis, and then tries to visualize as of what was happening there. There's also something which you could look at home. So, well, the development of the crisis in Europe is being highlighted here. We were still in a low interest rate environment, even before the financial crisis, as already said. This led to booms in real estate markets, in particular in Spain, but also in Greece and Italy, Portugal and Ireland. And that line of credit actually drew up quite completely during the financial crisis, as just said before. This led not only to a fall of housing markets in the United States, but also in other countries, in particular in Europe. Yes. Banks were badly exposed and needed support, otherwise they would have collapsed. That led to an increase in government debt situations. And what happened is that financial markets started to question whether some of these governments, in particular Greece, would be able to pay back these high debt levels, and started to ask for high risk premium on that, which actually implicitly meant that they had a liquidity problem. They couldn't refinance their own debt anymore. And we needed a troika, that means the IMF, the ECB, and the European Commission, the European Union, to step in and basically take over the role of financial markets and help bail out, in a sense, the Greek government. Of course, also here the moral hazard problem is at stake. To a sense, to quite some extent, it was always claimed inside the European construct that every country is responsible for its own fiscal situation. There would be no bailing out of governments by, in particular, Germany. Yes, because you as a country have your sole responsibility for your financial situation. That during this phase, as with the financial crisis, was being violated, in the sense this time it wasn't the bank who ran into problems, but it was the Greek government, in a sense, running into problems. And because of the interconnectedness between Greece and all the other European countries, we knew that if the Greek government were not able to pay back their government debt, then this would very likely lead to a banking crisis in other parts of the euro area, in particular in France. Yes, because in particular French, but not only French, banks were heavily invested in government bonds of Greece. So the interconnectedness story, which I told with respect to the financial crisis, also holds within the euro area, so to speak. Yes, but now it's a different level. We're not talking about mortgages and banks selling securitized products out of these mortgages, but we're simply talking about a government debt which need to be paid back, which need to be refinanced, and for which financial markets no longer were willing to provide the liquidity. Yes. Moral hazard is obvious here, as with the banks, in the sense that if a country like Greece would be bailed out, then the lesson learned for countries like Greece, not only Greece, but perhaps also Italy or Belgium or Portugal or Ireland, could be, well, at the end of the day, if things become very, very tough, then there will always be someone else, implicitly Germany, who is going to bail us out and pay the debt for us. Yes? And that's creating the wrong incentives, because if that's going to be the truth, then why start saving money? So what the Troika, that means the ECB, the IMF, and the European Commission did, is they put austerity measures in place. That's what usually the IMF does. If the IMF steps in, helps a country in need, then they always do that in exchange for reforms. Yes? trying to reduce moral hazard problems, so to speak, trying to circumvent that something similar is going to happen in the future again. Yes? Okay. In this particular case, it wasn't that there were some haircuts, so also some private market participants did pay a price for this, but at the end of the day, most of this was being paid by the Troika. Okay. Well, I already said quite a bit about Greece. That's being summarized here on one slide. Well, we have the problem which I highlighted. There is a contagion problem at stake. We couldn't simply let Greece not pay back the debt, because if that would have happened, then financial markets would have started worrying about, in particular, Italian debt. Italy also is a country with a huge government debt, and Greece is relatively small, and if that would be an isolated case, then that wouldn't be that disturbing for the rest of Europe. Yes? But it wasn't an isolated case because of the interconnectedness and because financial markets always think about, if this can happen to country A, then it could, of course, also happen to country B, because country B also is in a comparable situation. So that kind of contagion effects forces basically the Europe to act here and actually bail out to quite some extent Greece. Yes? Okay. Good. Well, there's always this question, was there too much austerity? Were we forcing Greece to reform, to do too many reforms? That's really, it's very difficult to say. Well, we do observe that there was a need for austerity because they couldn't run deficits as they did in the past for longer-term reasons. But of course, we also know that if you conduct austerity measures, so fiscal restrictive measures, in times in which the country is already not doing very well, then this might actually make it very problematic to get out of the recession in the first place. Yes, so there is this trade-off, again, between long and short run, so to speak. To what extent can we, would we prolong a deep recession because of the austerity measures? Yes. Well, the arguments in favor of fiscal consolidation is that we know that ultimately there are costs involved by having large debts. Yes, the cost of servicing a debt, for instance, you always have to pay interest on your debt, which the last decade was very, very low, but given the increase in the interest rates nowadays, again, this is coming back. There is, of course, always a likelihood that a government can default, although it's very, very difficult. It does happen. If we look at Latin American countries, it did happen. And as said, with respect to Greece, it partly happened. There was a bit of a default, although it wasn't labeled that way, but it was at least a partial default. This can also have consequences for the currency which is being used, also a reason why the support of Greece was from a euro area perspective perhaps needed, because it might have teared down the stability of the euro. Yes. Okay. Well, the other problems, given time, I think I actually do not go into details here. You can read that yourself. I actually would like to talk a little bit about the current situation, because we only have 5 minutes left. Yes. This is showing the framework as you have learned it here, the ultimate outcome, so to speak, not the Phillips curve perspective, but now the aggregate supply, aggregate demand perspective, which in a sense is very, very similar. Yes, and we can use this framework, or you can use this framework to analyze as of what is happening in the economy, very, very straightforwardly. And that's what we're doing here. We normally assume in our model that before the crisis hits, we're actually more or less in a steady state situation. Yes, and then we can observe or try to analyze of what is actually happening. And here I'm first talking about the pandemic itself, the year 2020. What has happened in the year 2020, and what did we in practice observe? Well, the corona pandemic actually led to a clear reduction in the supply of goods and services because firms had to close down. That was the lockdown effect, which led to a downward movement of the aggregate supply curve. Yes? Already back then, it was relatively clear that this is most likely going to be temporary. The question was how temporary is temporary, but the idea from the beginning was we will get out of this again, and the supply curve will ultimately be able, I'm talking about the supply curve, but here we see the demand curve, I have to rephrase. Start telling the story the other way around. The first reaction is there is a negative demand shock, in the sense that people stayed at home. Yes, we couldn't go out anymore, we couldn't have social events, we stayed at home, had our home office, and didn't spend time with others to the extent as we normally do. This reduced overall demand substantially. So that's the negative shift of the aggregate demand curve. Also, this, we knew, is probably going to be temporary. Yes, once the virus is being beaten or we have found solutions for it, we could see a movement back of the aggregate demand curve. The other shock, well, this in principle would have led to not only a recessionary situation, but also to falling prices. Yes? The other shock which happened at the same time, and which I already described, was actually the supply shock. Yes? The supply shock was firms were closed. They couldn't produce anymore. That's the supply shock. And that also happened. If you only take a supply shock perspective, then actually what should have happened is that prices would have increased. Yes? If the demand wouldn't have moved, but only the supply would have moved, we would have observed an increase in prices. Yes? Well, in practice, both things happened at the same time. So what actually happened, and that's what we probably see here, is both a supply and a demand shock. And if you look at the data, it looks like, in that sense, the demand shock was somewhat larger than the supply shock because overall prices tended to fall a little bit. Not a lot, but in 2020 we had a lower inflation rate or a deflationary situation as compared to what was expected. Yes? So from that particular perspective, it looks like the demand side shock was somewhat stronger in magnitude as the supply side shock. But both happened at the same time, leading to a very, very strong reduction in supply and demand at the same time. We moved from A to D during spring 2020. Okay, good. Now let's see. Okay. What happened since? And this is not going to be shown in the graph. I didn't have time to do all the animations, but we can start discussing that. Yes? What actually happened since is that, of course, firms were able to start produce again. On the one hand, the lockdown was only temporary. On the other hand, firms found ways in which they can still produce. Yes, they learned very, very quickly, actually much quicker than many of us expected them to do. Yes. So actually, the supply side shock was actually being reduced relatively quickly. And on the demand side, we also saw a relatively swift recovery. Yes. So, however, what we have observed is, and that's what I told you before, part of the story, not the only thing in the storyline, but part of the story has been that people have actually saved a lot during the pandemic period itself, because the government assured income levels, so income stayed where they were, but people were not able to consume as much as before. Yes? That led to higher savings than usual. Yeah. These higher savings actually led to the aggregate demand curve not only repositioning itself to the original blue line, but actually overshooting to some extent. Yes? In a sense, compensating things which we've lost during the pandemic year. Yes? If I talk to people, then at least this summer, for instance, many of them said, I don't care how expensive it is, but I'm going to have a vacation, a holiday. Because we had 2 years without a holiday, now we really need a break, and we're going to spend because I did save enough to allow myself to do this additional spending. So we spent, in a sense, more than usual. So the demand curve actually shifted out further than before. Yes. At the same time, also on the supply side, there was a normalization, but it wasn't a perfect one. We had bottlenecks. We had supply-side bottlenecks, and also in that particular sense, the supply curve didn't move completely back to the original position. And so whereas the demand curve overshot to some extent, the supply curve didn't move fully back to its original position, maybe up until now. Yeah. Okay, it's 6, so let me stop here. And next week, as promised, I will start repeating what we've learned during this class and start also to go through some of the homework or exercises which you found on Moodle. So hope to see you again next week then.